Chapter 3 of A New You. March. The room was gray and smelled of rot. She'd gotten tired of the pink, and not a word from Rob. She stood over the little sink and stirred the henna thoroughly, incorporating warm water into the green powder until she had a mud-like mass at the bottom of the bowl. The putrefying vegetal smell was overwhelming in the little cube. The outer room was ventilated to prevent her from going crazy from the fumes of acrylic paint, but the inner cube hadn't been designed with ventilation in mind. No matter. There was something primal and reassuring about the scent of henna. She'd never dyed her hair before, but it reminded her of something that she couldn't quite define. Something from outside. She leaned over the sink and took handful after handful of soft, warm paste and pressed it into her hair, which was long and hung clumped against her face, as she tried in vain to shake it away without spraying henna everywhere. She really could have used another pair of hands. She had no idea how difficult it would be to squeeze henna into every lock of hair, while keeping hair out of her eyes so she could see what she was doing. Her hands were both filthy with the stuff, so she couldn't touch her face to get the clots of henna out. She realized that she should have kept one hand clean while she applied the henna with the other. A bit got in her mouth, and it tasted like dirty spinach. She watched helplessly as her pristine little cube got splattered with henna despite her best attempts to remain self-contained. But she persisted, washed one hand awkwardly, and scrubbed her face clean and squeezed up underneath her hair in order to make certain that she'd gotten every piece. And when it was complete, she saw herself in the mirror and startled. Fat green tendrils hanging down all around, and she remembered when she had been picked to play Medusa on Mythology Day in 7th grade. At first she had been embarrassed, but then she did some reading and realized that she sort of liked the part of the myth where she got to turn men into stone with her large hypnotic eyes. She'd sprayed green dye into her hair and twisted in some plastic snakes and applied iridescent green eyeshadow and heavy black eyeliner and coat after coat of mascara until her eyes were more intense than she could ever imagined. She'd practiced the makeup at home every night for a week before Mythology Day, alone in her tiny bathroom while her mother was reading the newspaper and her father was reading her sister to sleep. Excuse me. Her neck began to ache as she rinsed the henna again, and green clumps kept on coming. Eventually, the water ran clear, but now her hair was all stiff and tangled, and desperately in need of conditioner. She reached for the bottle of Frisbee Gone and poured it deliberately onto her head, worked it in, and finally her hair began to soften. Rinsed again and scrunched the excess water out of her hair with a towel, and when she looked at the bits that were beginning to dry, she could see a definite reddish glow. She plugged in the blow dryer and was soothed by the warm air. Why hadn't Rob sent her any email? It had been weeks already, and every day that went by, she was sure that he had to respond. But then he didn't, and she didn't know how to feel. She figured there were only 3 possibilities. He hadn't gotten her email yet because he was away, but he'd get it soon, and then he'd definitely respond. Or he'd gotten her email and hadn't gotten the chance to respond to her yet because he was so busy, but he definitely intended to. Or he'd gotten her email and had no intention in responding, but she didn't like to dwell upon this possibility. He probably just hadn't gotten her note yet and would respond at any moment. He'd send her a charming note, his attention clearly piqued, and he'd tell her he'd been watching her work and wanted to see more. And they'd start exchanging intense emails about the nature of art and write so poetically and deeply, and she'd sneak him into the cube and he'd look into her eyes. But then she realized that there was a fourth possibility. Maybe the email address on Rob's website was out of date. This could mean that she might never hear from him, but not because he wasn't interested in her. He might never actually get her note at all, and she would never know whether he didn't respond because he didn't get the note or because he didn't consider her worth his time. How could she possibly tell the difference? She'd been checking his website daily for changes, but it always looked exactly the same. She held the hot end of the blow dryer close to her head and told herself to stop. That Rob was just a guy she didn't even know, and he was probably taken away. And she could never know anything for certain, and here she was driving herself insane when she needed to focus on creating. She tossed her hair back and stared at herself auburn. She looked older and less innocent, and oddly disconnected from her hair, as though it used to be a part of her, but now became an ornament. She had told herself that she'd go outside and work immediately after she finished with the henna. But as she looked at herself in the mirror, she grew more and more unsettled. Her face and hair had harmonized before, but now there was something unbalanced, and her face looked drab in comparison with the gleaming auburn of her hair. She decided to see what would happen if she painted her face. Just a touch of makeup and she'd be presentable again. She'd never worn much makeup before. Concealer over pimples and dark circles, and a bit of rose water lip tint, and some eyeliner in a shade called khaki suede that didn't stand out too much. But if she could color her hair, why couldn't she color her face as well? She placed an order with instantbeauty.com for a huge array of products. She had no idea what would look right and with her new hair, so she ordered Milady's makeover collection in every color available. The advertising copy promised to transfer her from blah into wow, which sounded tempting on this henna-scented day. She checked her email again and again while waiting for her makeup. 12 offers of pills to make her penis larger, a mass-mailed party invitation from somebody she'd fallen out of touch with years before, and an email from the grant people encouraging her to spend more time in the room outside the cube. The parcel finally arrived, and she opened it greedily, stroking the shiny plastic casings of her powerful new playthings. She started with lipstick, applied a bold brick red to her mouth, and was amazed at the effect. All of a sudden, she'd become so dramatic and glamorous. She blotted the excess on a tissue and blew kisses at the mirror, and ran the tip of her tongue over her lips seductively. Next, she selected a purple eyeshadow that was a beautiful eggplant color, but made her look bruised. She moistened a tissue with eye makeup remover and ran it over her lips until they were clear. Maybe blue would work better. She had a gorgeous peacock hue, but this one just looked tawdry, so she took it off as well. She went through the entire color wheel of shadows, getting more and more frustrated because of all she needed to do was find the proper shadow to complete her glamorous new look, and then she could go outside and work. But everything was somehow off, too muddy, or too garish, or clashing dreadfully with her hair. As she removed the problematic mauve, she noticed that her eyelids were now rather reddened and puffy, and made a mockery of her brick red mouth. She couldn't possibly go out like this, but how else was she supposed to work? Here, she'd spent all morning transforming her hair instead of working, and she only wanted to go outside and have everybody see her. And now it would be impossible until her eyes returned to normal, and she wiped off the lipstick, and hated the stain it left behind, and glared at her hair in the mirror, and lay down on the soft place on the henna-splattered floor, and cried. When she woke up several hours later, she berated herself for breaking down like that. So silly to let her appearance get in the way of work. She figured that maybe part of the problem was that she'd been slightly sleep deprived and wore a black satin sleep mask to block out the perpetual light coming into the cube from the room outside. But she'd been having trouble falling asleep lately, and she often woke up with the sleep mask off and found herself needing a nap during the day. So she needed a bit of rest after the henna. Not a problem. She looked around at all the little drops of henna paste and realized that she hadn't cleaned up anything. She took paper towels and soap and noticed that underneath every glob of green was left a little red spot. She scrubbed and scrubbed to no avail, and the little cube still smelled of rot. She told herself that she would never dye her hair again, and yet she couldn't stop looking at herself in the mirrors as she cleaned. Whose hair was this on her head, and why had she desired it? The proof would be in people's reactions to her hair. She'd gotten a constant stream of comments on her website about how fascinating her project was, and some people went as far as to say that she was cute. But what would they say when they saw her with this new look? Could she consider her appearance part of the project too? This way, she could figure that she hadn't wasted any time coloring her hair. It would be sort of like performance art, except that she had no intention of taking off her clothes. Control top stockings, black paint splattered skirt, and t-shirt, and she was ready to go outside the cube again. She looked at herself full length in the mirrors and decided that she'd try again with the makeup. The brick red lipstick would look so dramatic against all the black that she had on, and especially with her new hair. And she'd just avoid eyeshadow entirely this time, and it would only take her a few minutes to put on a better face. She applied the lipstick again and then realized that she was famished. So she opened her little refrigerator and stood there for 10 minutes eating buttered popcorn jelly beans and gummy frogs and malted milk balls until she got that queasy feeling in her stomach and her head began to spin. She'd done it again, eaten too many jelly beans and not enough chocolate. If she ate just one more malted milk ball, she'd set the balance in her stomach right. and crunch, and she loved the ancient dusty smell of malt, and the buttery, bittersweet chocolate overwhelmed her mouth. And the way the malty filling stuck to her teeth and released itself into small malty pieces that she could roll over her tongue as the chocolate flavor faded. And she craved another, just one more, and then another, and then if she had just one more gummy peach, just a small one, to clear her palate, she'd be balanced. She knew it. So she nibbled on the flat orange, sugar-coated gummy, marveling at the glimmering orange hue inside the matte exterior, and the peach-flavored perfume filled her mouth and nose and scented everything with warm, soft floral feelings, and a citrus sharpness and a tropical sensation that stayed with her after the candy had been swallowed down. Enough! Her stomach was stinging and taut, and her throat was coated with a sweetness. She drank a few handfuls of water and figured that she'd had enough to eat for the time being. Back to her makeup. The lipstick had worn off in the middle, so she reapplied it there, but then thought it looked uneven. Too moist in the middle, too dry around the edges. So she took it off entirely and applied it yet again. Not bad. Some dark brown pencil around her eyes, and she was finished. Finished! She would not let herself get carried away this time. She had important work to do. Outside in the gray canvas room, she noticed that she'd left a spot or two of pink behind. This would not do at all. She'd have to mix up some more gray paint to cover up the pink places so she'd have a uniform ground to start with. She squeezed some white into a bowl and delighted in its pristine cleanness. Then she went to work on her palette, mixing up a bit of this and that until she had a neutral gray that she could use to tint the white. With a little flat brush in hand, she went methodically over every corner of the room, reached up high to paint the ceiling, and crouched down low to paint the floor. When she'd finished scrutinizing every inch of her room for lapses in the gray, she stood back and noticed, with horror, that when the touch-up paint dried down, it was slightly off hue. Maybe it was too purple or too blue? In any case, it was a cooler gray, cooler than she'd used to paint the rest of the room, and she couldn't possibly start with a ground that wasn't even. So she sighed and went back to her palette and adjusted the balance with a touch of cadmium red in cadmium yellow, and until she was convinced that it was perfect. Mixed up another batch of white tinted with the new gray, and chose a slightly larger brush to cover the areas she had just painted. Started at a bottom corner and moved systematically up and over, but then her eyes started crossing and her head started to hurt, and she couldn't tell what she had already painted, and she couldn't tell whether the newest tint was maybe slightly lighter than the one that was just too cool, or maybe it just hadn't dried down properly, and had she painted that, or was it just a shadow? And the room started to spin gray around her. And she put down the bowl and brush and cupped her paint-stained palms over her eyes. The lighting in the cube was playing tricks on her, she feared. She'd always had an unwavering sense of color, but nothing looked quite right here. She could certainly use some little robots now to help her mix the paint. Maybe Rob had emailed her while she'd been out here working. She went into her cube and opened her computer, and still he hadn't sent her anything at all. She went onto her website and saw the final image of herself with her head bent forward and her eyes cupped in her hands, and noticed that on screen the room looked perfect, and her hair looked rather nice as well. What was the drama she had just put on? A devotional dance of detail? A passionate quest for perfection? She checked the comments section of her website and was delighted to see that several people thought her latest work was brilliant, including one who thought she was getting hotter every day. And that's the end of chapter 3.